Moving into a new apartment with a stranger is always a gamble. For Jacob, it was a risk he was willing to take. The rent was cheap and his new roommate Eric seemed normal enough during the first meeting. Quiet, a bit reserved, but polite. Yet there was something unsettling about the way Eric's eyes never fully met his, a fleeting unease that Jacob dismissed at the time. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob began to settle into the apartment. But soon the initial comfort began to erode as he noticed subtle changes in Eric's behavior. Eric spent most of his time in his room, rarely emerging except for late-night walks. At first, Jacob didn't think much of it. Everyone has their own habits. But it was what happened during those nights that gnawed at Jacob's mind. It started small, just the creaking of floorboards in the dead of night. But soon Jacob began waking up to find Eric standing in the hallway, staring at nothing. The first time it happened, Jacob froze in his bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited, expecting Eric to snap out of it to return to his room. But Eric stood there as if in a trance, his eyes vacant, his body unnervingly still. He never acknowledged Jacob's presence, just stood there, motionless, until eventually retreating to his room without a word. Night after night, Jacob found himself waking up to the same scene. Eric standing in the hallway, his face barely visible in the dim light. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. The atmosphere in the apartment grew thick with tension, a tension that weighed heavily on Jacob's chest, making it hard to breathe. One night, curiosity got the better of Jacob. He decided to follow Eric on one of his walks. He slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and trailed Eric down the dimly lit streets. The night was cold, the air heavy with the scent of rain, and the only sound was the soft shuffle of Eric's feet on the pavement. Keeping a safe distance, Jacob watched as Eric wandered through the dark streets, his movements erratic, almost trance-like. At one point, Eric stopped abruptly, his head turning sharply toward a shadowy alley. Jacob held his breath, his heart racing as Eric stood there, staring into the darkness as if something, or someone, was staring back. Jacob's heart raced when he saw Eric stop at a random house, peering through the windows for several minutes before moving on. The house was dark, its windows like empty, soulless eyes staring back at them. Jacob could feel a cold sweat forming on his brow as he watched Eric's pale face reflected in the glass, his expression unreadable, almost detached. What was he looking for? And why did he choose this house? The next morning, Jacob confronted Eric about his late-night activities. The apartment was eerily quiet as they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the silence between them heavy and oppressive. Eric's response was cold and unsettling. He claimed he didn't remember anything, that he often sleepwalked and had no control over it. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he had rehearsed this explanation many times before. Jacob wasn't convinced, but what could he do? The more he pressed, the more Eric's demeanor changed, his polite facade slipping ever so slightly, revealing a glimpse of something darker, something that sent a shiver down Jacob's spine. Things escalated one night when Jacob awoke to the sound of his bedroom door creaking open. His eyes snapped open, his body rigid with fear as he lay there, the darkness pressing in from all sides. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and quick, as the door creaked ever so slowly, inching open. He froze, pretending to be asleep as he heard soft footsteps approaching his bed. The sound was almost imperceptible, like a whisper of fabric against the floor. But to Jacob it was deafening. His mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next, every muscle in his body tense with terror. He could feel Eric's presence looming over him, the air thick with tension. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and the door quietly clicked shut. Jacob lay there, drenched in cold sweat, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What was Eric doing in his room? What had he been planning? Terrified, Jacob decided he had enough. He moved out the very next day, leaving behind a cryptic note for Eric, apologizing for the sudden departure. The apartment felt different as he packed his things, darker, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had almost happened. that he had narrowly escaped a fate he couldn't even begin to understand. As he was packing his things, he found something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in Eric's closet were pages and pages of notes detailing Jacob's daily routine, his likes, dislikes, even his sleeping patterns. Each page was meticulously detailed, as if Eric had been studying him, learning his every move. The notes were filled with observations, speculations, and plans that Jacob couldn't fully comprehend, but that filled him with a deep, primal fear. It was clear Eric had been watching him closely, planning something sinister. The realization hit Jacob like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless and trembling. He felt violated, exposed, as if his very soul had been laid bare for Eric to dissect. He stuffed the notes back into the closet, his hands shaking, and hurried out of the apartment, not daring to look back. To this day, Jacob doesn't know what Eric's true intentions were, but he's certain that leaving was the best decision he ever made. The memory of those nights haunts him still, a dark shadow that follows him wherever he goes. Sometimes in the dead of night, he finds himself waking up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see Eric standing at the foot of his bed, watching, waiting. When Sarah moved in with a new roommate, she was thrilled. The apartment was in a great location, the rent was affordable, and her new roommate, Lily, seemed friendly. At first glance, Lily appeared to be the perfect roommate, cheerful, tidy, and respectful of Sarah's space. They quickly fell into a comfortable routine, sharing meals, chatting about their day, and even watching TV together on lazy evenings. But there was one thing that struck her as odd. Lily's room was always locked. She never opened the door, never talked about what was inside, and never let anyone in. Sarah would catch glimpses of the heavy lock on the door, and though she tried to ignore it, a nagging curiosity began to grow. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. People have their privacy, and she respected that. She had her own secrets after all, and understood the need for a private space. But as time went on, the mystery of that locked door began to gnaw at her. She would find herself staring at the door during quiet moments, wondering what could be so important that it needed to be locked away. The door became a presence in the apartment, an unspoken tension that hung in the air, growing heavier with each passing day. What could Lily be hiding? One night, curiosity got the better of her, and she asked Lily about it. Lily's response was evasive, almost defensive. Her cheerful demeanor faltered, her smile becoming strained as she quickly changed the subject. It was as if a shadow had passed over her, a glimpse of something darker hidden beneath her friendly exterior. She claimed it was just storage, nothing more. But her eyes told a different story. They were filled with unease, almost fear. Sarah noticed the way Lily's hands trembled ever so slightly, the way her gaze flickered nervously toward the door, as if she was afraid of what might happen if it were ever opened. Sarah knew something wasn't right, but she decided to drop the subject, not wanting to cause tension. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew in the back of Sarah's mind, refusing to be ignored. That changed one evening when Lily left in a hurry, forgetting to lock her door. It was a rare stormy night, the wind howling outside as rain lashed against the windows. The power flickered on and off, casting the apartment in and out of darkness. Lily had rushed out saying she needed to run an urgent errand, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the unlocked door. Sarah knew this was her only chance to find out what was really behind that door. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she approached the door. The apartment seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy and oppressive, as if the very walls were warning her to turn back. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. What could be so important that it needed to be locked away? Slowly, she pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down her spine. She half expected to find something mundane, a cluttered storage room perhaps, or old furniture covered in dust. But what she found was far from ordinary. The room was sparsely furnished, but what caught her attention was a large old trunk in the corner, partially covered with a sheet. The trunk was ancient, its wood dark and splintered, the metal hinges rusted and worn. It exuded an aura of age and mystery, as if it held secrets long forgotten. On top of it were photos, dozens of them of Sarah, taken without her knowledge. The photos were laid out meticulously, like a twisted collage of her life. They captured her at all times of the day, sleeping, eating, even just walking around the apartment. Some were recent, others dated back to when she first moved in. The realization that Lily had been watching her every move made Sarah's blood run cold. Shaken, Sarah opened the trunk, dreading what she might find. The trunk creaked open slowly, the sound like a scream in the silence of the room. Inside were more photos, even more invasive than the ones on top. These were taken from close range, some from just outside her bedroom door, others from within her own room. The photos were interspersed with personal items that had gone missing over the months. Her favorite necklace, a journal, even a toothbrush. But what terrified her the most was a detailed journal describing Lily's plans to become her, to take over her life. The journal was filled with pages upon pages of Lily's meticulous observations, her habits, her preferences, even her deepest fears. Each entry was written with an obsessive precision, chronicling Sarah's every move, every word, every interaction. The final pages were the most disturbing, detailing a plan that involved erasing Sarah entirely and replacing her with a twisted version of Lily. It was clear that Lily had been living a double life, one where she was both herself and Sarah, blurring the lines between the two until they became indistinguishable. The room seemed to close in on Sarah as the reality of the situation sank in. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of Lily's obsession. Panic set in as she realized that she was alone in the apartment, with Lily potentially returning at any moment. Sarah quickly gathered her things and left the apartment, not even waiting for Lily to return. She moved with a sense of urgency, her hands shaking as she packed a bag with whatever she could grab. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap, each shadow hiding the potential for danger. She couldn't afford to stay another second. She moved in with a friend and never looked back. Her friend welcomed her with open arms, but even in the safety of her friend's home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that Lily was still out there, waiting for another chance to take what wasn't hers. She never found out what happened to Lily, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to take what wasn't hers. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Sarah would wake up in a cold sweat, her mind filled with the image of Lily standing in the shadows, her eyes filled with that same unsettling mix of fear and obsession. And in those moments, Sarah knew that the nightmare was far from over. When Ben moved into his new apartment, he was excited to start fresh. He had recently gone through a tough breakup and was eager to leave the past behind. The apartment building, though old and a bit run down, had a certain charm that appealed to him. The creaky wooden floors, the vintage fixtures, the old-fashioned elevator that seemed to have a life of its own. All of it made the place feel like it had a story to tell. The building was old with a bit of charm, and his roommate Tom seemed like a laid-back guy. Tom was easygoing, always ready with a joke or a cold beer, and the two quickly became friends. But from the beginning, there was something off about the place. Strange noises in the walls, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and that constant feeling of being watched. At first, Ben dismissed it as the quirks of an old building. He had lived in old buildings before and was used to the odd creak or groan in the night. But this place was different. The noises weren't just random. They had a rhythm, a pattern that Ben couldn't quite put his finger on. And the drafts, cold, almost icy gusts of wind that seemed to come from nowhere, left him shivering, even on the warmest days. But then, things started disappearing. Small items at first, like keys or a phone charger. Ben would tear the apartment apart looking for them, only to find them in the most unlikely places. His keys in the freezer, his charger tucked inside a book. At first he thought he was just being forgetful, but the incidents kept piling up, becoming harder to ignore. Then larger things, like food from the fridge or clothes from the laundry. One day, he opened the fridge to find half of his groceries missing, even though he was certain he had just stocked up the day before. His favorite shirt, which he had just worn, vanished from the laundry basket, only to reappear weeks later folded neatly on his bed. Tom laughed it off, joking about ghosts, but Ben wasn't so sure. Tom's easygoing attitude did little to reassure Ben. The jokes about ghosts were funny at first, but as the strange occurrences continued, Ben found himself growing increasingly uneasy. The building, once charming, now felt oppressive, as if it was closing in on him. The noises in the walls grew louder, more distinct, scratching, tapping, even what sounded like faint whispers in the dead of night. Ben would lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds that seemed to be coming from just behind the walls. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to communicate with him, trying to get his attention. One night, after returning from a late shift, Ben noticed something strange. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. As he stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted him, but this time, there was something different. A faint smell in the air, something sour and damp, like old, rotting wood. A faint light was coming from behind the walls in the hallway. He stood there, staring at the wall, his mind racing. There was no logical explanation for a light to be coming from inside the wall. He approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, the light flickering and fading as if it were alive. Curious, he pressed his ear against the wall and heard soft breathing. His blood ran cold. The breathing was slow and steady, almost as if someone was lying right on the other side of the wall. He pulled back, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just heard. Was it an echo? A trick of the mind? Terrified, Ben woke Tom, but when they investigated, there was nothing there. No light, no sound, just the cold, empty walls. Tom was groggy and annoyed, his irritation clear as he fumbled with the light switch. But when the light came on, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The hallway looked just as it always did, silent, still, and unnervingly normal. Tom tried to reassure Ben, but there was an edge to his voice, a hint of something that Ben couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Or was it something else? Tom shrugged it off, suggesting it was just Ben's imagination playing tricks on him after a long day at work. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something, or someone, was living in the walls. The idea consumed him, filling his thoughts during the day and haunting his dreams at night. He started avoiding the apartment, spending as much time as he could outside, but the feeling of being watched never left him. He even tried to stay at a friend's place for a few nights, but the moment he returned, the oppressive atmosphere closed in on him once more. Things escalated when Ben found a hidden door in the back of his closet. It was a small, almost invisible door, the kind that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The paint was chipped and peeling, and the wood around it was warped, as if it had been exposed to moisture for years. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped out from the darkness beyond. It led to a narrow crawl space that ran behind the walls of the entire apartment. The space was cramped, the air thick with dust and mold. Ben had to crouch down, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he squeezed through the narrow passage. The walls were covered in graffiti, strange symbols that seemed to swirl and twist in the dim light. And then he saw it. A small makeshift living area, complete with a mattress, blankets, and a few personal items. An old battered radio, a stack of worn-out books, and a tattered backpack filled with clothes and canned food. It was clear someone had been living there, someone who had access to their apartment, who had been watching them and taking their things. The realization hit Ben like a punch to the gut, leaving him reeling. He felt sick to his stomach as he looked around the space, trying to imagine the person who had been living there, hiding just behind the walls, watching him, listening to his every move. How long had they been there? How had they managed to stay hidden for so long? Panicked, he rushed out of the crawl space and confronted Tom. But Tom's reaction was unexpected. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that Ben had finally discovered the truth. Tom confessed that he had known about the stranger in the walls all along. His voice was calm, too calm, as he explained how the previous tenant had warned him about the wall dweller, a homeless man who had been living in the building for years. Tom had tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the truth was he was just as terrified as Ben. The stranger had been there long before either of them moved in, and Tom had been too afraid to do anything about it. He figured as long as they left the stranger alone, he would leave them alone too. But Ben couldn't stay another night in that apartment, knowing someone had been watching him the whole time. The very thought of the stranger, lurking just beyond the walls, sent a wave of panic through him. He packed his things in a hurry, his hands trembling as he threw his belongings into a suitcase. The apartment felt like a prison, the walls closing in on him, suffocating him. He couldn't get out fast enough. He moved out the next day, leaving the apartment and Tom behind. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the stranger was still there, hidden away in the walls, waiting for his next unsuspecting victim. But the story doesn't end there. Ben couldn't escape the memories of that apartment, the feeling of eyes on him, the sound of breathing in the walls. Even in his new place, far from that old building, the fear followed him. He started noticing little things, missing items, strange noises in the night. And he couldn't help but wonder, had the stranger followed him? Or was it something worse? Sometimes, Ben swears he can still hear the faint scratching in the walls no matter where he goes. He lies awake at night staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling, and wonders if the stranger is still out there, moving from wall to wall, apartment to apartment, watching, waiting. And in those moments, he knows that the nightmare will never truly be over.